All right. Welcome everyone to the new format Bible study for the season of Lent. We are reading the Epistle of James, and there are 6 weeks in Lent, but only 5 chapters in in this epistle. So we're going to be doing over the first 3 weeks. We're going to be reading the first 2 chapters. We're splitting it up a little funky there, and then in weeks 4, 5, and 6, we'll read a chapter a week. But so I'm keeping it mostly grouped to the way that the headings work in our Bibles. So even if you're reading a paraphrase translation like the Message, it should still the chunks that I've picked should still work and make sense. Um, but before we get to that, I'm going to give a little background about uh, the what is when this was written, who wrote it, as much as we can tell, and kind of what the ideas in a general sense are behind it. And if any of the rest of you are familiar with this epistle, please feel free to jump in, because I am not the only expert in the virtual room. Um, so first off, when was this written? As far as we can tell, this was written at the near the end of the first century, or beginning of the second. And this is what's known as a Catholic epistle. Not Catholic as in Roman Catholic, Catholic as in it was not written to just one community. You'll notice that many of the epistles that we read, like Philippians, was written to the Philippians, and that's where it gets its title. This one was written by an author that we call James, um, and to a lot of different people. And so it's Catholic because Catholic means universal. And so this was meant to be distributed widely to people in the diaspora, Christians who are living outside of the immediate Holy Land area. Um, when we when we're talking about the author, so James is how this is introduced. That's the first verse is James, a servant of God, is writing this letter. Now there are two Jameses who are prominent in the New Testament. One is one of the apostles, James the son of Zebedee. The other is James the brother of Jesus. Uh, it's pretty easy to rule out James the son of Zebedee because uh, he was killed by Herod Agrippa in 44. Um, so probably was not around at the point of writing this, even if we're assuming that it was directly written. The more likely, historically, what people have said is that this was written by James, the brother of Jesus, because he was a prominent leader in the Jerusalem early Christian community. We learn a lot about him in the book Acts of the Apostles, that he had great concerns about um, the idea of following Jewish law and how Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians should relate to one another. Interestingly, that does not really come up in this letter. Um, and also, if James is the brother of Jesus, he would have written in the language that Jesus primarily spoke, which is Aramaic. And this was written in very eloquent Greek. So even though this is said to have been written by James, and we believe it's probably meant to have been written by James, the brother of Jesus, we think it was actually someone who was in his school of thought who wrote it. And uh, this was common at the time, where you'd use like your teacher's name as a way to show them honor and to get authority in your writing. And everyone understood that it wasn't necessarily them writing it; it was their school of thought was writing it. So that's likely what is going on here. Is we don't actually know the name of the author, but it's someone who um, saw James as a person worth looking up to. Uh, the last thing I will say before we get into this is that it's addressed like a letter, but really once we get into this, into the body of this, it's not really structured like a letter in the same way that many of Paul's letters were written. It's a list of moral teachings that just has dear friends at the top, um, and it's a focus on morality, and doesn't really mention Jesus much. It's more general morality than it is strictly theology, but those two things aren't as separated back at this time period in history as they are now, because there was an understanding that all morality uh, for Jewish and early Christians, um, for those people, that it came from wisdom that was given to them by God, and that was where you got your moral teachings. So that's kind of um, a general overview of some of the context of this. I don't know if I know David mentioned he had done some research ahead of time. I don't know if there was anything you'd like to add to that little introduction, David.
I think you've done a fine job, and I agree with what you say. Um, I don't think it's essential to get into a lot of detail because of what he has to say. Like you say, it's more wisdom literature, so it's not as critical. It's not to understand the exact context or anything. Yep. Right. Yep.
All right. Well, with that, why don't we go ahead and dive in? For this first week, we will be reading chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. And I will share my screen. And is there someone who would be willing uh, to read these verses?
I can go ahead
Thank you, Leslie.
and um I'll read what's on there on the screen if you want me to, and I can do that, but you'll have to scroll it.
I'm happy for you to read what's on here or to read from your own Bible, whichever you would prefer. And I
Okay, because I'm reading out of um the New Living Bible or whatever this is. The
yeah,
New
fine.
Living Translation. Okay. All right. This letter is from James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. I am writing to the 12 tribes, Jesus' believers scattered abroad. Greetings. Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing. If you need wisdom, ask our generous God, and he will give it to you. He will not rebuke you for asking. But when you ask him, be sure that your faith is in God alone. Do not waver, for a person with divided loyalty is as unsettled as a wave of the sea that is blown and tossed by the wind. Such people should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Their loyalty is divided between God and the world, and they are unstable in everything they do. Believers who are poor have something to boast about, for God has honored them, and those who are rich should boast that God has humbled them. They will fade away like a little flower in the field. The hot sun rises and the grass withers. The little flower droops and falls, and its beauty fades away. In the same way, the rich will fade away with all of their achievements. God blesses those who patiently endure testing and temptation. Afterward, they will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. And remember, when you are being tempted, do not say, God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. So don't be misled, my dear brothers and sisters. Whatever is good and perfect is a gift coming down to us from God our Father, who created all the lights in the heavens. He never changes or casts a shifting shadow. He chose to give birth to us by giving us his true word, and we, out of all creation, became his prized possession.
You, Leslie?
I love it. I like the part where it says, God is tempting me. And you're not supposed to say that because God never attempts to do wrong. And I agree with that statement. He never does make us do wrong. That's our own self getting in the way.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think that it it can feel easier to blame God when things are going wrong. I know I've talked some with other people about this, that it feels like we we thank God for all of the good things, but then we don't curse God for the bad things, and I know that has been frustrating for some people.
Well, this is not necessarily what the Jewish people always believed either. Uh, if you go back into the Old Testament, there was a belief that all things good and bad come from God. So
Mhm.
this is a development in thinking. Uh, I don't know. I didn't do a lot of research into if this is typical Second Temple Judaism thinking, or if this is something that the author here is introducing. But it is a different way of thinking because you look at passages from Job, and although God wasn't doing it directly, he was giving permission, and other places. There was a belief at one time that everything, good and bad, all came from God. And so this passage here is saying, you know, God doesn't do that. That's kind of reassuring to me. I know people, I do know people that are going through trials, and sometimes they're reassured by the idea that, oh, God sent this, and so he's going to give me the strength to get through it. But I think I'm not very comfortable with that idea that God sends bad things our way. I, that seems a little arbitrary to me. You know, maybe arbitrary is not the right word, but anyway, go ahead and respond. It looks like you're ready to say something.
To answer your question, David, yes, there had been a development in Judaism. What you were talking about in Job, uh, it was much more common to see Hasatan, the adversary, as a title, and it was some in that book. There's scholars who believe that this was a role on God's council, that God worked with this person and did good and bad things to people. But by the time we get to when the Gospels are written, it's become common in Judaism, even before Christianity, that this adversary was personified into an opposing force, which was a little bit of what I talked about last Sunday with what we think of as the devil. That idea that there is some separate evil that is, so that God is the good, and then there's the opposing force that had come about in the Second Temple period.
You know, I think a lot of that has to do with extracultural um, inf- influences too. I don't think that's integral to Judaism to come to that understanding.
Well, and if this epistle was written by a Greek, a Hellenic scholar. I mean, isn't it possible that it wasn't a someone of the Jewish faith, but a Greek Christian? I don't know, who would have these newer ideas that God is good.
It it certainly could have an influence. It was, I think we can fairly safely assume that the author, whether of Greek background or Jewish background, was a monotheist at this point. Um, they had separated from the Greek idea of the pantheon of multiple gods, but there might have been some influence from those ideas that led to the separation of good and evil. That's possibly a part of it.
I don't think there was a strong notion yet in Hellenism and the religions there yet that God was primarily good. Their pantheon was not necessarily and the gods in it were not necessarily gracious and loving. They were pretty arbitrary and capricious at
Mm-hmm.
that point. So I
And
think Judaism and then Christianity is kind of leading the way in this. And of course, yeah, more of the world religions moved to this during the axial age. But yeah, before that, it was not a common belief that God was gracious and good and that you could trust him in all that, different gods were that way. So, but anyway, yeah, it's interesting that this is very good Greek, they say. So we don't really know who wrote it, whether it was someone who was related to James or what. Probably not. Probably maybe not James anyway. Or as you said, maybe it was edited. But yeah, so a lot of these things are pretty hard to pretty hard to get a specific handle on. It's happened so long ago, and we don't have all the source material. So, but also this particular book, James, wasn't part of the canon very early. Just it in Muratorian canon, which is one of the earliest canons, about 200. James wasn't included, and then he was included. Started to be in the Epistle was included in some canons starting about the third or fourth century. So yeah, yeah. So anyway, just
Yeah, thank you for adding that.
they just Martin Luther wasn't so excited about it, and
Um,
well, Martin Luther, of course, was very much emphasized justification by faith. And we'll find out later that there's reasons why justification by faith is impugned a little bit, if not in actually the way Paul taught it, but the way it became to be later practiced. That there seems to be a little conflict either between James and Paul, or at least between the way some of the people who followed Paul were teaching the justification by faith, So, but because James's whole polemic here, as we'll see, is kind of shaped a different way. But anyway, so
yeah, this is definitely the argument for good works. If not instead of faith, it's good works in addition to faith.
or that, you might argue that you really don't have faith if you don't have good works. The good works kind of
Mhm.
show that your faith is true living faith. So I don't know how everybody wants to parse that, but it's interesting though that there is in the background of the New Testament in several places there are glimpses of differences between the apostles and their theology to begin with. That Jude's another one that seems to be really possibly polemic against Paul, to say that
Mhm.
no, Paul's not getting it right here. You need to do the right things. But they were people and they were trying to get it right. And they were starting a new religion, and they were trying to get it right. And James is, I don't know, they say he's from the center church, but I don't, and maybe it's his concern with the law that might be part of it. But yeah, ethical behavior is very important to James here.
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to point out, so this is, I think we will have, it'll be a little easier to have discussions as we move deeper into this epistle. This is kind of a weird week because we're mostly reading introduction right now. Um, but the two main things that are coming up in this introduction, and one of the things that is nice about the Catholic epistles is that they're these general universal issues that are not particular to one community. And the two issues that are being introduced here are people are going through very difficult trials that are testing their faith. And also, there is wealth inequality that is very concerning to the health of the community. Those are kind of the main points that he's presenting here, which I think it's safe to say that both of those things are still true in many of our Christian communities.
I just was looking, and they said that the word double-minded in verse 8 is kind of unusual. It's not used a lot in biblical passages. It's from let's see, the word is dipsukos, and it literally means two-spirited, vacillating in opinion or purpose. So that's what they're talking about here. It's an interesting use because it's not used a whole lot in the New Testament or elsewhere. So it affects, I guess it would affect what his view of faith is. And so.
Well, it seems to me is very similar to the idea that a person cannot serve two masters,
Yeah.
God and mammon.
Yeah, I think so.
Um,
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry, David.
No, you go first.
When I was talking to my mom on Sunday, she reminded me of a book that Greg had us go through, and it was Holy Imagination. I believe the lady Judy Fentress Williams was one of his instructors. I read through it. And I don't want to read the whole thing. James' teachings on faith works in the form of a diatribe, a dialogue between the writer and an imagined interlocutor. In this diatribe, the writer invites the audience to listen on a performed conversation, to step back and consider the argument from a distance. Although James reflects a different understanding of faith and works, it does not stand in opposition to Paul's view. Where is it? The letter is perhaps best described as Christian wisdom literature. In James, the author draws on Old Testament wisdom traditions and mixes it with teachings that resemble the Sermon on the Mount, encouraging the audience to endure hardships and to stand firm during testing. That's all I'm going to read of that. But she brought it up to me, and that gave a little bit more clarity than the message.
What did that clarify for you?
I I think the most part of it is I'm one of those people, okay, what did I do, God? Why did I make you mad that you're doing this to me? And I have to remember that, God doesn't do that. He wants good for me.
Mhm.
He doesn't want to see me scared or in a constant state of anxiety. Um, I also kind of am the firm believer that the adversary is doing the job that God gave him to do, and that he might throw things in your path so that if you're on the right path, he's trying to get you off it.
Mhm. And I was having a conversation with some people on Sunday about you said that the job that the adversary is supposed to do, and there are examples in nature that we need some amount of stress to survive. Now, I don't want to get carried away and fall into the trap of saying everything happens for a reason and all of the bad things that happen to us are part of some plan, because I think some suffering is a mystery. But one example that was really clarifying for me is I learned the story of there was a biodome that was created. And in this perfect atmosphere, they had all kinds of plants and they had everything that they needed in this perfectly self contained environment. And the trees would get to a certain height, and then just all of the sudden they would topple over and die. And it was because there was no wind. The way that trees are able to grow deep roots is because there is a little bit of the stress of the wind pushing against their branches that causes them to become stronger. And so uh, without that stress or that adversary to some extent, they aren't able to grow the way that they should. And so I do think that there is definitely some idea of God in whatever form that looks like gives us something to kind of push us out of the nest at times.
I get that.
I think the question is, of course, whether that's a personal adversary or a force, or whether it's just part of the natural world, that God's world is not a tame world. C.S. Lewis talked about that, but that God, it's a wild world and there are things that happen and we need to struggle, and that's just part of life. One thing I was looking at here real quickly is kind of contrasting verses 9 and 10, and something that James brings up that's much more like Jesus in his view of rich and poor.
Mhm.
That's much more like the Gospels than most of the Paul doesn't deal with this issue with a great deal, you know, contrasting rich and poor and things like that. But yeah, so he is leading off with that, like you were pointing out just a moment ago, that there is a whole bottom up view in the Gospels. And this very much is being, resonates in James as well, that in the kingdom of God, it's an upside down world. And that those who are not rich in the things of this world, God loves them and uses them as an example of what kind of person he would like us to be. And our focus should be on those who are not the most affluent. But I think there's an implication here that the rich being brought low assumes that the rich are not using their resources. They're much like Lazarus in the New Testament, who had, or no, excuse me, the rich man who had Lazarus right there and didn't help him. And these people aren't, yeah. And so, and their day is going to come all of our day will come, but it'll be measured maybe on the basis of how we lived our lives. And so I guess that's why I like James, because it seems a lot more similar to the gospel than some of the things that are in Paul. But anyway, so yeah,
And I
that's
think Dawn mentioned in that portion that she read that there are similarities specifically between the Sermon on the Mount and those verses that you are mentioning, David. The
sure.
really 9 through 12 is you can see the similarities there. Were you about to say something, David?
I'm just looking on farther 12 to see if we've, I was just thinking of the whole concept of temptation and everything.
Hmm.
And that, yeah, yeah, in a sense that verse 13 is interesting. No one, when tempted, should say, I'm being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted. So God is not the author of confusion or temptation. God is not both evil, doesn't bring both evil and good for James, but for James, God is only a force of good. And what leads us away is just the way we are.
Mhm.
The influence, whether it's he hasn't filled this out, whether it's the influence of the world or what it is, but the fact that we don't sin because God tempts us to sin. We sin because we we have desires, and those desires get out of hand, and that's just a natural process of being a person. And so when that happens, you know, don't be deceived that don't blame God for your bad things.
Yeah, and I do like that it separates. It's not sinful to be human, to have these desires. It's how you said it, that when those desires get away from us. I think that's a good way to look at it.
And I think a lot of people today, this is very relevant to the way people believe, because a lot of people turn away from God, become atheists, agnostics, because they don't believe in a God that lets terrible things happen. It just makes no sense to them. When people do bad things, when bad, the world or whatever, the idea that how could God let such things happen? But I think what James is saying, these things don't happen because they're God's will. These things happen because that's just the world we live in. It's the way the world is. We have to understand that God is giving us good gifts and God is there supporting us. But these things aren't, brought in my evangelical background. I've had people say that, well, I heard people say, like, I don't know if you're familiar with Joni Erickson Tada. She was a person who was back when I was younger. She was a biblical teacher, and she had been paralyzed when she dove into a pool. And her argument was that, well, God had that happen to her so she would turn towards him. And there's a lot of theology like that in the evangelical world, that God will let terrible things happen to you, either for your further benefit or for the benefit of others. And when you take a look at a God that would do that, that's nothing like a loving father at all to me. Just to cause bad things to happen so that one of your other children or something, to discipline, have something terrible happen to you, to discipline you, to bring you back to where you need to be. And that's why I think a lot of people, they look at the Old Testament, they look at a lot of things, and they say, well, why would I want to serve a God like that? Why would that make any sense to me? When God does these terrible things, when he's so uncruel and unfeeling. So I think James has something to speak to a lot of people right now. And
Yeah.
a lot of people who are atheists and agnostics, I can say, I understand why you don't believe in that God. I don't believe in that God either, so because I don't think God's that way. So anyway.
Yeah, I've always liked the saying, I don't believe in the God that you don't believe in either.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is a difference. In the Old Testament, we've got the fire brimstone, and then in the New Testament, we have a loving Christ.
Well, I don't know that it's quite that clear cut, to be honest. There are plenty of examples of God being kind and gentle in
Oh, yeah.
the Old Testament, and there's some pretty harsh words from Jesus in the New Testament. That Jesus came not to bring peace but the sword.
Okay.
Um,
But what does he mean by the sword? Yeah, so yeah, that's my question, Brian. Yeah, what is that sword? Is it a sword that does that indicate violence, or does it indicate there's going to be division based on the fact that there's truth to be stood up for and there's things to stand against that's going to separate families and things like that because of the pointedness of the gospel. Yeah, I just to tell you where I'm coming from. I wouldn't call myself a pacifist. I would call myself a peacemaker. But that's kind of like a pacifist plus. But anyway, so yeah, I believe that pacifists they don't do anything to stand against evil or violence. I think we need to be like Jesus and take definite actions that turn violence on its head.
Mhm.
But
I agree with you. I
yeah.
I just want to caution us from thinking that there are two versions of God. There's
Oh yes.
the mean version of God that we get in the the Jewish scriptures, and then the kind, loving God that we get in the Christian scriptures, because that has caused problems throughout history, and that's just something that we need to be aware of.
I think John Dominic Crossan said something that I think is very interesting, and that he says the history of the Bible, the evolution of the Bible, what we constantly see is God revealing himself as kind, gracious, compassionate. And the biblical authors and the religion of the times gradually, or all throughout time, when God reveals himself that way, they try to rationalize that. They try to ameliorate it, try to make him less gracious and less loving by what they believe at the time. And I think what we see is an evolution of the belief in God. Because very early on, the culture around the people in the Old Testament, it was all about capricious deities that you need to placate with sacrifices and things like that to keep them on your side so they wouldn't do bad things to you. And I think Christianity, or Judaism and Christianity here at that time is bringing us a new notion
Mhm.
of a God that doesn't need to be placated, but a God that reached out to reconcile us to Him, to help us understand. And I think in verse 18, I was just looking where it says, in fulfillment of His own purposes, He gave us birth by the word of truth, so that we would become a kind of first fruits of his creatures. And I don't think he's talking about Jesus by name, but that's what I think he's referring to here. The word of truth and
Mhm.
the fact that the first fruits of his creatures. So although he isn't referring to Jesus explicitly, I think implicitly. At least that would be the way. I didn't really look here to see what they say in my study Bible, but yeah, the word of God. Yeah.
Mhm.
Anyway, which is called in John, that refers to Jesus, but I'm not sure if James was on board with that or not. That's just my speculation at this point.
I suspect you're
But I
right.
think yeah, I think there's an evolution of belief, and I think it's showing itself in James here
Mhm.
that we no longer have to believe in that kind of a deity, but God, we can believe in a God that's compassionate, a God that only does good. And that bad things happen. You can blame the devil, you can blame nature, creation, whatever. But that's not coming from God. Those are things we have to live through to live in this world. And God only has good for us, and He's promised that He will be with us in these times and help us. So yeah.
And that goes back to the beginning of the verses, which we kind of skipped over a little bit, where it talks about for you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. And that's, I think that's when we're tested with things, I think that's when we start questioning things one way or the other. And then it does help us grow one way or the other. I mean, sometimes it might cause us to grow different than what we thought we were, where we were going. And so I just think it's, and just let it grow. So let it grow, for when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and needing nothing. I don't think we're ever fully developed, because I think you get to a point where you're constantly growing. And if you're not constantly growing, you're getting stagnant in one spot, and you're not really growing, even though people say I'm growing because I'm spending time in the Bible, and that's fine, and in learning. But sometimes you need that alternative ideas of things, or you get, or your problems that you have, but what you learn to accept those and move on, and then it might change your direction in your life, or just in your thoughts and processes of theology, or whatever you're thinking about. So I just like those verses too, because it does help you grow, even though we do have temptations, we do have sufferings, and we all do. We all have issues. Not There's not one person that's going to slide through this life without any type of issues. So anyway,
Then it kind of implies here, what does faith mean? Does faith mean never having doubts? Does faith mean that, believing the right things? But I tend to believe, I had a professor in the New Testament who defined faith as a whole soul trust in God. So your faith is not in the circumstances or what's going to happen. The faith's not what you know, but the faith is a trust in God, regardless of what happens to us, to know that God, as James is saying here, doesn't ever intend ill for us. He's not the author of evil. So, yeah, yeah. It takes some time to work through these passages and see how these things all work together sometimes. They just didn't throw words down on paper, so, but
That's
yeah,
true.
it's a process.
Yeah, and it's why we'll take some time over the next 5 more weeks to keep diving into this. And I think what we'll do next week, I think Leslie, you brought up a very good point that there were verses that we didn't focus on. I think what we might do is read half, do a little discussion, and then read the second half, so that we can break things up a little bit more.
yeah.
But with that, I think we're a little past 2 o'clock, and I think we can end here for the day. Thank you all for joining, and I'll see you all either Sunday or next week.
Thank
Bye,
you very
everybody.
much.
Bye
Thank you.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.